We're talking about the common uses and application of the Kratos flywheel, but before we do that, we're going to talk about how the Kratos is different from traditional barbell and dumbbell strength training. In traditional barbell, dumbbell, and machine-based strength training, the primary means of resistance is going to be via gravity. The loads are also going to be fixed. You have to pre-select a load to use on a barbell or pre-select the weight of a dumbbell. With the Kratos, the load can be variable, and the primary means of resistance is isoinertial. That is where the flywheel comes in. Think about the flywheel as a stored energy mechanism. That's not quite the way it works, but it also is kind of the way it works. When you provide resistance to the flywheel stores energy for the opposite phase of movement. So when you go through the starting phase of the squat, or maybe actually let's think about the coming out of the hole from a squat, as soon as you hit the end length spool on the flywheel, it is now going to reapply a very significant amount of load during the eccentric or lowering phase of the movement. And that is going to be the biggest difference, is how load is applied to muscles. Don't think necessarily about movements per se. Think about how the muscles are being worked between traditional based exercises and the Kratos. In traditional based exercise, peak force is going to be applied in the concentric phase of movement. And the concentric phase of a muscle is going to be when the muscle is shortening. That is when the muscle can provide peak force. Now, when it comes to the Kratos, peak force is actually going to be experienced during the eccentric phase of movement, or the lengthening of a muscle. That is going to allow you to have unique strategies within your resistance training program to target muscles differently, or target rep and set schemes differently than you would be able to with traditional exercises. The final thing that we're going to look at is volume. And think about volume not necessarily as sets times reps, because we don't really look at sets and reps with a flywheel. Think about time under tension. Because you can change the resistance of the flywheel on the fly, you can, pun intended, you are able to do a whole lot more work in more time, because as you exhaust your muscles, you can actually continue to perform work because you can change the resistance. If you wanted to do that with a barbell, dumbbells, or machines, you would have to stop the exercise, change the loads, and then re-enter the exercise. With the Kratos, however, it makes it very efficient to string together multiple exercises or change loads through the same exercise. Say you wanted to perform conditioning work on the unit, you would be able to sustain effort for a very long period of time, because as you reach the certain level of exhaustion with the amount of force you were putting into the flywheel, you would be able to continue working by simply just doing a little bit less. And by doing a little bit less, I'm referring to the amount of effort you're putting into the flywheel, or the amount of force you're putting into the flywheel. Now, the final use and practical application of the Kratos that we're going to discuss today is applying it to individual sports. Now, the list of applications for this is really endless, but there's a few that I'm going to discuss today. The first is going to be MMA, wrestling, and combat-based sports. Because those sports are usually involving two people trying to push somebody into a position or to overcome a certain position, the type of loading that is involved in those sports is far different than, say, sports that involve more running and jumping. When you resist movement, you are exposing your body to an isometric and eccentric load, which is really where the Kratos is going to shine. Not necessarily in the eccentric or the isometric loading, but in the eccentric loading. When you perform squats or rows or presses on the Kratos, you are going to actively feel the flywheel pulling against you. It is not just you moving the load, it's you resisting the motion of the flywheel. And that's why it's such a good use for combat sports, MMA, and wrestling. Other uses could involve potentiation-based training for power development. If you wanted to prime your nervous system prior to doing jump training, sprints, bounding, things of that nature, the Kratos can be an excellent way to overload the eccentric phase of the movement prior to going into your jumping or bounding training. Typically, this is going to result in higher neuromuscular facilitation, which is going to allow you to jump higher or bound further. The final application that we're going to talk about is reintroducing an athlete to load who is maybe taking time off of training, whether it be during a period of an off season, maybe it's in a summer prior to school starting for high school sports. The Kratos can be used to reintroduce tissues such as tendons, which are typically take longer to reacclimate to load. Because the period of which the athlete is going to have to just train versus performing their sport is so low, being able to introduce those tissues to load in a much shorter period at a much more intense rate can be very useful, because it is very safe to do that on the Kratos as it's compared to traditional base training. Those are going to be some of the common uses and applications of the Kratos. The list certainly doesn't end there, but those are going to be some of the ones that many people don't often think about when they look at a flywheel.